Hannah Ridgewood never expected life to be fair. She had stopped believing in that kind of symmetry the day her husband collapsed in their kitchen, a half-poured cup of coffee trembling in his hand as he fell to the floor. A stroke, the doctor said, sudden, massive, irreversible. It happened before she could even register that he had slurred his words. Before she could call his name a second time. One moment they had been arguing over whose turn it was to pick up groceries, the next, she was a widow at 34 with a child and a mountain of grief disguised as paperwork. 2 years later, the house still bore his shadow. His tools lined the shed as if waiting for their owner. His coat remained hung behind the door, undisturbed. She couldn't bring herself to move it. Sometimes, when the world was quiet and Ethan had gone to sleep, she would slide it over her shoulders like armor, hoping it might warm the parts of her heart still frozen. Living in Westbrook, Ohio, meant routine. Factories, freight trains, smokestacks curling gray into grayer skies. It was the kind of town where you earned your living with your back, not your dreams. Hannah worked at Truxton Auto Garage, tucked between a rail depot and a faded diner with a blinking neon sign. The shop smelled of motor oil, rust, and fried food from the place next door. She had started there 3 years earlier, just to get by, just to have insurance. She stayed because it became the only thing she could control. Though she was the most SK*-led mechanic in the shop, the unspoken hierarchy made her invisible. The other techs were younger and louder, their jokes bouncing off the cinderblock walls like ricocheting nails. Bart Truxton, the owner, was a man built like a muffler, loud, wide, and indifferent to nuance. He called her Hanny and assigned her the junk jobs, alternator swaps on freezing days, engine flushes without lifts, exhaust welds that left her arms singed. Raises came like lottery wins, always promised, never delivered. But the paycheck, small as it was, covered Ethan's school lunches, the rent on their 2-bedroom apartment above a pawn shop, and sometimes enough extra for a second-hand book or weekend pancakes. She kept a thermos in her locker. Red, chipped along the edges. Matthew's name was still written inside the cap in permanent marker. She filled it every morning with coffee and carried it home at night still half full, like she couldn't bear to finish it. That thermos was the last thing he'd touched that morning. A detail no one else would know, but one she never forgot. It was on a Thursday, as autumn settled into its full brittle chill, that a boy entered the shop just past closing. His coat was too light for the season, sleeves fraying at the cuffs, the collar stitched with blue thread where a tag had been torn away. He held a wrecked electric scooter in his small hands like it was a living thing he hoped could be saved. The scooter was bent, the wheels warped. One handlebar had snapped clean off. He stood just inside the doorway, silent, as the wind whispered through the open garage bay. Hannah looked up from the transmission she had been inspecting. The boy didn't speak, but he carried something, a folded letter, clutched tight against his chest. His name was Logan. He was 10, maybe 11, with cautious eyes and scraped knuckles. The scooter, he eventually conveyed, had been a gift from his older sister. She was stationed overseas with the Marines. It had been his birthday present. He was supposed to ride it during the Veterans Day assembly at school, in her honor. A careless driver, pulling into the teacher's lot too fast, had crushed it against the curb. Hannah didn't need to ask more. She saw it immediately, the quiet in his posture, the deliberate way he didn't cry. She had seen it in Ethan. The way kids carried grief like a secret. This scooter wasn't a toy. It was a lifeline. A connection between siblings whose time together had been interrupted by duty and distance. Bart had already left for the day. The garage lights buzzed overhead. No one else paid attention. She took the scooter gently from the boy's hands and set it on the bench like it was fragile. It was more damaged than most would bother fixing. But she said she'd take a look. That night, after she had tucked Ethan into bed and washed her hands free of grease, she opened her stash of savings, 4 wrinkled 20s, 6 5s, and a crumpled 10. That was the electric bill money. It wasn't much, but she had priced out the parts. A new throttle assembly, replacement grips, a soldering kit for the wiring, and a fresh coat of paint if she could find leftover enamel in the shop bin. She ordered what she could and promised herself she'd work off the bill in overtime, somehow. The next day, she returned early and stayed late. The scooter became her mission. She rewired the motor, replaced a broken bar with a salvaged piece from a junk e-bike, reattached the brake line, and carefully applied a new layer of red paint. She even restored the military decals, printing new ones at home using her son's school printer. On the final night, she polished the chrome until it reflected her face, tired, lined with effort, but strangely content. She imagined Logan's sister receiving a photo of the repaired scooter, knowing someone had cared enough to make it whole again. She imagined what it might have meant to her if someone had done the same for Ethan after Matthew died. She didn't expect thanks. She didn't leave a note. Just left it by the door with a quiet hope that it might carry something more than wheels. The next morning was colder than the day before. Frost clung to the corners of windows, and the sky hung low, the kind of gray that pressed on the shoulders. Hannah woke early, as she always did, and boiled water for coffee in the dented kettle that had belonged to her mother. She wrapped her coat around Ethan, kissed his forehead, and watched him shuffle off to school with his backpack bouncing unevenly on his narrow frame. At the garage, the others hadn't arrived yet. She liked those early moments best, the quiet before the music came on, before the machinery started whining. She pulled open the rolling door and brought the scooter out onto the pavement. The red gleamed beneath the thin morning light. She had even tied a ribbon around the handle, one she found in an old drawer, once part of a Christmas box Matthew had given her. Logan arrived exactly at 7:45, led by a school counselor who had called the shop the day before to confirm it was ready. He stood still for a long time, staring. The boy's expression didn't change much, but his hands twitched slightly, the way hands do when the heart wants to reach out but the body isn't sure it's allowed. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and ran his fingers over the handlebars, the paint, the decals. She didn't need words. The way he gripped the handles said everything. He nodded once. She handed him a small envelope with a printout of the wiring diagram, just in case. She'd even written a note on the back in her clumsy handwriting, "Ride safe." She'd be proud. It wasn't signed. She turned back toward the shop, ready to finish the oil change that had been left half done yesterday, but she didn't make it past the threshold. Bart Truxton was standing just inside, a styrofoam coffee cup in his hand and disapproval written clear across his face. He had come in early, something he almost never did, and what he saw was a customer-less transaction in the parking lot, a shop project completed with no paperwork, and a scooter he didn't recognize. She didn't lie. Hannah never had a gift for it. She told him the truth. That the boy's sister was deployed. That he had brought the broken scooter in and she had fixed it. That no money had changed hands. Bart didn't yell, not at first. He just looked at her like she had broken something sacred. His words came flat. She had used shop supplies. Taken electricity. Consumed inventory. Acted without authorization. Set a precedent, he said. What if everyone came in with sob stories? Was she going to fix every bike and board that rolled through the door? She tried to explain that she used her own money for parts, her own time. That she had stayed after hours. That it wasn't about precedent, it was about one boy, one gift, one moment. But he had already made his decision. He walked to the back wall, pulled her time card from the slot, and tore it in half. The rip echoed louder than anything he could have shouted. She didn't argue. Didn't ask for a second chance. She just nodded once and stepped to her locker. She changed out of her coveralls slowly. The cold from the concrete floor seeped into her shoes. Each movement was deliberate, mechanical. She took her thermos and tucked it under her arm. The scooter was already gone by then. Logan had disappeared down the street, unaware. Bart didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Outside, the clouds had begged asterisk end to break, a thin strip of blue cutting across the horizon like hope refusing to lie still. Hannah sat in her car for a long time before turning the key. She didn't cry. There wasn't time for that. She drove to the school and watched through the fence as the Veterans Day assembly began. Children stood in rows holding paper flags. A few parents gathered on the sidewalk, shivering in their light jackets. And there, near the front, was Logan. He wasn't riding the scooter. He was standing beside it. The decals shone even from a distance. The ribbon fluttered slightly in the breeze. She didn't stay for the end. She drove home, changed into jeans, and opened her laptop. The job postings were bleak. Minimum wage, part-time, seasonal. None of them promised insurance. Most asked for experience she didn't have or hours she couldn't cover with Ethan's school schedule. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She refreshed the page twice. Then the phone rang. She almost didn't answer. It was late afternoon, and the only calls that came then were spam or bills. But the area code was unfamiliar, and something inside her stirred. The voice on the line belonged to a man named Eli Whitmore. He said he had seen a video. Something about a woman fixing a scooter for a boy whose sister served in the military. The video, apparently, had been captured by a customer walking by, who caught the tail end of the exchange and the confrontation with Bart. Hannah didn't know what to say. She wasn't part of anything viral. Eli said he wasn't calling to offer charity. He didn't believe in pity. He believed in something else, something he said she already had, and quiet abundance. He asked if she could meet tomorrow. Somewhere neutral. A local diner, maybe. Just a conversation. She hesitated. Ethan was due home soon, and there were bills to sort and pride to swallow. But the voice on the line didn't rush her. He just said he'd be in town for one more day and that he hoped she'd consider it. She hung up and stood in the center of the apartment for a long moment, the silence pressing in. She opened her thermos. The coffee inside had gone cold. But she drank it anyway. It tasted bitter. But real. 1 year later, the building still smelled faintly of new paint and fresh lumber. The front windows gleamed with early morning light, and the words "Hands of the Heart" curved proudly across the glass in gold leaf. The sign had been designed by a local artist who offered her services for free after hearing Hannah's story. It had taken months to finish the interior, and even longer for Hannah to believe it was truly hers. But now, the doors opened with a gentle chime and the air inside buzzed, not with engines, but with purpose. Hannah stood near the back wall, her hands resting on her hips, watching as a group of teenagers gathered around a workbench. A boy was learning how to use a torque wrench. A girl beside him was sanding down a dented fender. Another kid in a wheelchair was assembling wiring with laser focus. Each of them had come through the door not just needing a SK*LL, but needing a place to feel steady. They wore coveralls like hers and shared the same grease-streaked fingers. The wall behind her had become something sacred. It held more than photographs and medals. It held stories. A wooden plaque carved with precision read "Wall of Honor." Beneath it hung framed portraits of local veterans, faded letters, worn patches, and in the center, Logan's scooter, immaculate, mounted as if in flight. The military decals were still there, now laminated under glass. A folded flag stood beside it. Below, a single line was etched into bronze, "For those who believe kindness is an investment." It had been a phrase given to her by Eli during one of their long talks before the shop opened. He had become a mentor of sorts, not just financially, but philosophically. He told her that good people rarely got credit, but they kept the world stitched together. That if she wanted to build something that would last, she needed to start with her own story and give others a reason to believe in theirs. The first few months had been difficult. There had been doubt, resistance, the quiet judgment of those who only believed in second chances when they came with disclaimers. Some locals still whispered about what happened at Truxton Auto, still took Bart's side. But others, teachers, veterans, mechanics, even teenagers who had once drifted toward trouble, began to show up. Slowly, the tide turned. Not because Hannah argued, but because she kept showing up. Because the shop never closed its doors to someone in need. Word spread, as it always does when people witness something steady and unselfish. Veterans stopped by with old vehicles and stories they hadn't told in decades. One brought his grandson to learn about engines. Another brought his Purple Heart and left it on the wall with a simple note: "She fixed more than the scooter." Ethan came after school most days. He had grown taller, his voice deeper, but he still sat on the same stool near the back, working on model cars and asking too many questions about torque. He didn't remember every detail of the hard years, but he remembered how hard his mother had worked. And now, when people asked about her, he didn't just say she was a mechanic. He said she was someone who helped people find their hands again. In the far corner of the shop, a man was waiting. His name was Marcus, a retired Army engineer who volunteered part-time to teach electrical work. He greeted each kid with a patient nod and stories about roadside repairs and war zones. They listened not because he had rank, but because he respected them enough not to speak down. Even Bart had come by once, not to apologize, but to drop off a box of spare parts with no return address. Hannah didn't display them, but she used every bolt. That, she figured, was enough. The mayor had visited on Veterans Day. A small ceremony was held. A local reporter covered it, and the story made a quiet splash online. But Hannah didn't attend for attention. She stood in the back with her hands in her pockets, her head bowed during the moment of silence. The world had shifted, but not loudly. It had bent toward kindness, almost imperceptibly, the way light bends through glass. Now, each morning before the doors opened, Hannah would walk the perimeter of the shop and touch the scooter. Just once. Not for luck, but for memory. For connection. For the knowledge that doing one quiet thing right could ripple wider than any shout. Sometimes, new students would ask about the scooter. Who it belonged to. Why it was mounted there. And Hannah would just say it belonged to someone who reminded her what it meant to hold on. And to someone else who never let go. In the end, she didn't reclaim her old job or demand anything back from those who had doubted her. She had found something better. A place where dignity didn't come with a receipt. Where broken things weren't discarded, but rebuilt. And where kindness, without question, was always enough.